Very early in my teaching career, I had a fight in my classroom, and it started next to the word wall. It wasn't a terrible fight, it was really more of a shoving match, but it shook me because it happened just a couple of days into the teaching portion of my teacher training. I was running a 7th grade summer school class with one other trainee, and because we didn't have much experience, it took us longer than we should have to realize what was going on. And here's a sketch of how I remember the classroom because I want to point out some of the issues that I can now see looking back on that moment. Over here was the word wall, which was a bulletin board we had set aside so that students could put up vocabulary words as we learned them. The bulletin board was in a corner of the classroom and it was partially blocked by some piece of classroom furniture. I think it was that we had used a bookshelf to create some type of quiet reading nook, which LOL, once this group of kids came in, this all-boy 7th grade summer school class was not going to be using a quiet reading nook. But we didn't know because we had blocked off that area with the bookshelf. There wasn't much visibility from the front of the classroom, which is mostly where we were standing while we were teaching. Also, as you can see in the drawing, there was only one way to get in and out of this nook area, and there was not nearly enough space for the number of boys that we sent in there all at the same time. So 1 week earlier, we had been excitedly decorating this classroom, putting up the word wall, the reading nook, and whatever else we had planned for the summer. But in our well-meaning inexperience, we had created a tiny hidden mosh pit inside our classroom. And then we sent a summer school class of junior high boys in there to fight over a tape dispenser. So, there are some rookie mistake elements to this, but this was also my first crash course in how the physical layout of a space can affect people's behavior. A few years later, a friend who manages a supermarket recommended this book to me. It's called Why We Buy: The Science of Shopping. I read the book just because I thought it was interesting. It was written by a retail psychology consultant, which I had no idea there was such a thing. And it's really written for retailers. But as I was reading it, I kept having these aha moments about how my classroom was set up. Fast forward about 2 decades. I still have this book on my shelf, and I recently reread it. And to explain why, I want to make sure to introduce myself. My name is Roxana Eldon. I'm an author and course creator. And I've spent about 20 years working with teachers in various ways to make the job more manageable. And I've seen many situations where a physical change in the classroom can offer an easy win for classroom management. Today, I'm going to share the 6 takeaways from the science of shopping that I think apply most directly to teachers. The first takeaway is that friction matters more than you might think it does. Friction is the retail and marketing term for little moments of inconvenience that can affect someone's sense of whether a purchase is worth the trouble. An example of friction that you can probably relate to is if you've ever been at a drugstore and the item you wanted to buy was in a locked cabinet. At that moment, you have to decide whether it's worth tracking down someone who can unlock the cabinet. And of course, if you have to press some type of button that's going to say, employee needed in the hemorrhoid cream aisle, you're probably not going to do that unless you need that product really badly. Potential embarrassment is definitely a source of friction. And if that goes for adults, imagine how much more it applies to students who are going through some of the most awkward stages of their lives. Friction also does not have to be as extreme as the examples I just gave. It takes surprisingly little friction to make a customer decide it's not worth buying something. One example is that parents who are pushing strollers will sometimes skip a purchase if it requires them to squeeze the stroller in between tightly packed racks of merchandise. People are also less likely to reach up for something on a higher shelf or bend down for something on a lower shelf than they are to grab something that's right in front of them. And actually, this phenomenon is now so well known in the retail world that companies will pay to have their products placed on the easiest to grab shelves. So if shoppers will sometimes skip a purchase just so they don't have to reach up or bend down, what does that tell you as you're trying to set up your classroom? Are there times during the day when students need to bend into awkward or uncomfortable positions to access supplies or in order to put things away the way you want them put away? And if so, can this be avoided? If it can't be avoided completely, that's okay. If there's something you only take out once a semester, that can be on a high shelf or in a classroom closet or somewhere where people need to stand on a chair to be able to grab it. But pay attention to where your prime real estate is. If there's something students need to access every day, you want that to be in the most easy to grab place possible. And the same goes for yourself. If there's something you need to stand on a chair to reach, you're probably not going to do it every day. The next principle from this book that definitely applies to your classroom is that people naturally avoid places where others are likely to bump into them. The author of the book, this retail consultant named Paco Underhill, has identified this phenomenon that he calls the butt brush effect. This is something his team saw over and over again, where people would walk away from a spot in a store if they could feel people passing too closely behind them. Often we don't realize we're doing this. It's a subconscious behavior. Although I definitely started noticing it after reading the book. But where it comes to any type of purchase where customers really need to compare colors or look at the items for a while, they will not stand there and do that if they feel like they're constantly getting brushed from behind. Classrooms can be really tight spaces. So it's worth thinking about how students can use high traffic areas without constantly bumping into each other. Oh, and this is especially true if everyone is wearing a giant backpack. The next concept in retail psychology that can help with your classroom management is called the landing strip or the decompression zone. One of the findings described in Why We Buy is that people need a little bit of time to slow down once they enter a store. You probably see this built into most of the stores you walk into. And the reason is because people don't just enter the door of a store and immediately start shopping. They need a few steps to slow down their walking speed, get used to the new space they're in, and kind of then look around and see what's going on. One of the pieces of advice the book gives to retailers is to never put anything you want customers to interact with in that decompression zone or landing strip of a store. I would argue that the same thing is true in your classroom. Students walk in the door, there are other people waiting to get in behind them. The more natural course of action is for them to get into the door, slow down from hallway speed to classroom speed, and then kind of flow toward their seat and get a sense of what's going on for the day. So what does that mean for your classroom setup? Well, let's say there's something you want students to grab as they walk into the room, like a worksheet. That should be positioned far enough into the room that they don't have to immediately stop short and pick it up. You also may want to position yourself a few feet into the classroom. If you like to greet your students as they come in, you might want to do it a few feet inside the door. Give them some space to come in, relax, and come toward you while you're saying hello. You don't want to force anyone to create a traffic jam right at your classroom door. Takeaway number 4 is that it's worth taking the time to get your classroom signs done right. There is a whole chapter in Why We Buy just devoted to store signs. Why? Because most people hate to ask what might be a silly question just to get basic information. I said most. A well-designed and well-placed sign can keep people from being confused. But you want to make sure that students can see it from where they're sitting. You want to make sure they will see it when they need to see it. And you want to make sure that they can read it from wherever they will be when they're looking at it. Chances are you have helpful written information posted all around your classroom. So this might be a good time to just move around the classroom, look at the information you have posted, and ask, is this where students will see it and be able to read it when they need this information? The next takeaway is actually a bigger overarching concept, which is that when space is not being used the way you thought it would be, there's often a hidden lesson. In other words, some of the student habits that annoy you might also be telling you something. For example, are there areas in your class where a mess is constantly building up? Are there areas in your classroom that you cannot see or that might inadvertently be rewarding bad behavior? Are there areas that might affect students' comfort, like where does the sun come in? Where does the AC or the heat blow most strongly? And are there students that prefer to sit in the hotter or colder areas? Some of these things you'll be able to figure out from observation, and others you may want your students to tell you about. In the description below this video, you'll find a link to a student survey and activity where students can help you improve your classroom layout, which might even involve helping you clean up the classroom, but in an educational way. The final takeaway is that efficiency isn't everything. And a quote I really liked on this topic is, "A chair says we care." That quote refers to how stores can take care of people who are not necessarily customers themselves, but who have to wait for someone else to finish shopping. And one of the things those people like is to be able to sit down. But that quote also reminded me of something I once saw in a teacher's classroom when I was doing an observation. This teacher had somehow put a couch in her room. And while I was there, a student arrived for class. He wasn't carrying a backpack. And the overall vibe I got is that this student mostly didn't carry a backpack. He goes to the couch, reaches under the couch, and pulls out his copy of the novel they were reading in class. And what I realized is this student, who's probably chronically unprepared to most of his classes, had figured out a way to be prepared for just this one language arts class. This old grandma couch that this teacher had somehow made room for gave him the inspiration and the physical space to figure out how to do that. What is the exact lesson to be learned here? I'm really not sure, but maybe it's just that the effort to show students you care sometimes doesn't conform to rules of efficiency. And that's probably okay. Some space is never wasted. By the way, if you're looking for resources curated by the type of nerd that would read this 250-page book twice and make a video out of it, you will find links to several different classroom resources in the description below this video. You'll also find a link to my free classroom management troubleshooting guide. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.